Following the creation week, we enter directly into what I call the Edenian epoch. This is the period of time between the creation week and the fall when humans lived in the Garden of Eden. The end of the creation week, the entire creation is labeled very good or described as very good in Genesis 1:31. We deduce from that it is a time of shalom. This Edenian epoch is a time of peace. It's a time of no biological evil, no natural evil at all. There is no suffering. There's mutualism in the biological world, but no parasitism. There's life. There's no death. There's no death of nephesh life. There's no death of humans or animals in this period of time. Animals and humans both eat plants, and there is no carnivory. No animals are eating other animals. There is health, no disease. There's developmental aging. You can mature from young to adult, but there is no degenerative aging among the organisms of the world. The creation is apparently sustained indefinitely. If, in fact, the fall had never occurred, the sun would have burned forever, it seems. The humans would have lived forever. Animals would have lived forever. The universe would have persisted forever, probably indicating that there were processes, cyclical processes, that were re-providing everything that was utilized during this period of time. How long did this period of time last? We actually don't know. The Bible does put some constraints on it. We can see in Genesis chapter 3 that there apparently has already been a habit formed between God and man walking together in the cool of the day, which would suggest that at least a few days had elapsed since the end of the creation week before the fall. That's the minimum. At the maximum side of things, we learn in chapter 5 that Adam was 130 years old when he begat his son Seth, who takes the place of Abel, who is killed by Cain. And the birth and the inception of Cain and Abel occurs after the fall, after Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden. So you'd take 130 years minus the age of Cain to get a maximum amount of time, or minimum amount of time that you take 130 years as the age of Adam, subtract the age of Cain at the murder of his brother, and that gives us a minimum amount of time that elapsed after the fall before Adam bore his child. That could mean there's as much as 60 years of time between the creation week and the fall. We don't know how much time actually elapsed. I'm inclined to think maybe a few years of time. This period of time, the Edenian epoch, turns out to be a foundation for an ethic for us. For what happened during this period of time, this period of shalom, of peace, this period of no biological evil, is the standard. This is what God wanted. This is what God created man to live in until man sinned from it. It's something of the nature of things it's going to be after God recreates it and cleans everything up again. As a consequence, when we want to know what should we preserve, what should we change in the world that now is, what should we consider a pathology, what should we consider a bad thing in the present world, we can use the conditions of the pre-fall world, of the Edenian epoch, as our standard. If something existed in the pre-fall world, the Edenian epoch, this is something that we shouldn't eliminate in the present world. This becomes something to help us make ethical decisions even in the present. The Edenian epoch is terminated by the curse. It suddenly ended when God cursed the creation because of man's sin. At that moment, It wasn't the moment that Adam actually sinned. It was when God responded to Adam's sin with a curse that God changed how he sustained the entire universe. It's at this time that the universe begins to wax old, as doth a garment, as the Bible would say. It is at this time that the universe, which would have, if man had not sinned, apparently have existed forever, this is the time when the universe begins to die. It waxes old every day, such that when it comes time to glorify humans, God is going to have to recreate the universe or renew the universe into its original or desired state. It's at this particular point in time that biological repair processes, which in the Edenian epoch were probably perfect in the sense of fully repairing any damage that might have occurred within biological systems, becomes less efficient, just a little bit less efficient. As a consequence, over time following this event, degenerative aging is going to enter into the creation. Organisms are not just going to mature up to maturity, they're going to degenerate towards dying of old age, of natural processes. Pathology is going to enter into the world. Disease is going to enter into the world for the first time and increase in frequency and commonness throughout the time that follows. Genetic load is going to come in for the first time. Before this, there were no mutations in the genetic material of any organism. At the fall, however, at the curse, we have the beginning of mutations accumulating in organisms, and thus the increase in genetic load through time. At this time, while the creation is degenerating with natural biological evil, God introduces some things into the creation to limit the spread of that evil across all of life, preventing that natural evil from destroying the beautiful pictures he has created of his own nature. God introduces nephesh death, death of animals, death of humans, into the picture so as to minimize the suffering that those organisms would have to endure given the curse. God then adds overproduction among all organisms so as to replace the organisms that die in order to minimize the suffering. The overproduction, in turn, generates the process of natural selection that eliminates further or narrows further the spread of natural evil in the world. It minimizes pathology, pathogens, and so on, making things as healthy as they could possibly be in a world that is cursed. God also introduces or reveals from hidden genetic information predation, animals eating other animals, which again is a way of minimizing the spread of evil that comes with the curse. God also reveals from the genetic information of organisms defenses for organisms to be able to survive in the now newly introduced process of predation. With the curse, we terminate the Edenian epoch and we begin the next period of Earth history, the antediluvian period, or the antediluvian epoch. This is the period between the curse and the beginning of the flood. In Scripture, we're told that this is about 16 and a half centuries of time. And it was described in 2 Peter as the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. This is a different world than the present world. Because the flood involved processes that don't occur in the present, it's very difficult to infer the nature of this world. You have to interpret it through the claims of Scripture, but it is a world different from the present. It is the antediluvian. Ante is on the other side of. Diluvium refers to the flood. So this is on the other side of the flood from us. Some of the differences between the antediluvian epoch or period and the present are that in this period, the antediluvian period, there were more created kinds, more Brahmins than there are in the present. Here's a partial list. You can't read them, there's a lot of them. This is from the fossil record. The first group of things are just the extinct classes of organisms that are found in the fossil record, not in the present, that must have existed in the antediluvian period. The next group of things are the orders of animals and plants and so on that existed in the pre-flood world that don't exist in the present. The point being that there's lots of Brahmins that have gone extinct since the creation that existed in the antediluvian period that indicate the past world was more diverse, with more diversity of Brahmins than we have in the present. The antediluvian epoch also had different ecosystems or combinations of species that we don't find in the present. It had, among other things, what I think is a reef or large reefs actually made from bacteria in hot water situations. It had something we call in the fossil record I've forgotten the name of it. A fossil ecosystem that doesn't exist in the present. We've got Paleozoic invertebrate ecosystems in this period that we don't find in the present. All sorts of critters, trilobites and ammonites and things like that that we don't see in the present, that we see in the fossil record, that must have been beautiful and diverse ecosystems we're not familiar with today. We've got flying pteranodons and dinosaurs in this period of time before the flood that we don't have today. I believe we have a floating forest on the ocean that is very different from what we have today, and animals that lived on that forest that we are not familiar with in the present world. There's also a warmer Earth in the antediluvian period than we have today. It's not a unitemperate climate, it's just warmer. So the zones, the tropical zone that's limited to within 15 degrees of the present equator, probably stretched further towards the poles, maybe even as far as 40 degrees north and south. There was no ice on the pre-flood antediluvian world. The temperature at the poles was probably something on the order of cool temperate rather than the extremely cold polar zones that we have today. So it is a warmer Earth. During this period of time, according to Scripture, humans didn't eat meat. They have a diet that is entirely vegetarian in nature, entirely plant in nature. Humans also lived during this period for more than 900 years. People have often speculated about how that might be, what conditions on the earth would have allowed that to be. Most probably it's not due to environment or what people were eating, but rather is entirely a genetic phenomenon. God programmed humans to live that long after the curse, and He reprogrammed them again following the flood so that their longevities, their lifespans decreased towards the present. The antediluvian period, epoch, probably involved changes from the beginning of the epoch to the end, which actually would warn people of what is about to happen. The end of the antediluvian epoch is going to be the flood, a judgment on human sin. But I would suggest that God made it clear to humans long before the flood that things weren't going the way they're supposed to go, and that things were falling apart, and God was about to do something very serious. I think they were supposed to get the message and in fact change their behavior, which in fact people did not do. First of all, we see directly from the biblical account that there's an increase in evil, moral evil in particular. We have humans apparently being very cruel, murder increasing. It says that violence filled the earth, all flesh filled with violence, which at first glance, looking at it, you'd think, oh, we're referring to all humans showing violence. But of course, nephesh is the word translated flesh, refers actually not just to humans, but also to animals. So there's a suggestion here that not only were humans morally evil, during this period and increasing their moral evil. But animals also were being nasty, were being cruel. Violence was spreading across the earth in both animals and humans. It's likely that because the fall is the introduction of carnivory and disease and all of that, that it would have started out with very low frequency at first, very little disease, and then disease would increase with time. So my suspicion is that during this period there's an increase in disease, in violence of both animals and humans. The world is unpleasant in that regard, and increasingly unpleasant as it moves towards the flood. There's also suggestions in the biblical text that the work of humans in trying to get food out of the ground becomes increasingly difficult during the pre-flood world, the antediluvian period. Because when we see Cain killing his brother, God punishes Cain not by Cain being put to death, capital punishment. That's not introduced until after the flood. Instead, Cain is punished by the ground not producing food that it otherwise would, which suggests that Cain is cursed for murder by cursing the ground and cursing plants, which suggests wherever Cain went, it would curse the ground. And there's a suggestion that, in fact, God punished all murder in the same sort of fashion, which would have increasingly made the earth, the soil, not yield what it had before in terms of food, and it would become increasingly more difficult to make a living farming throughout the course of the antediluvian period. By the time we get to the birth of Noah, which is 600 years before the flood, his father names him Noah because in his days, so Jared would argue, in his days, we will find rest from our work, from our toil. So apparently in the days of Noah, which is pointing to the flood, there would be an end to this toil that humans are under trying to raise their food for a living. And that suggests that, in fact, that the ground is becoming increasingly difficult to get food from. That's 600 years before the flood. Also at the end of the flood, or actually after the flood, God promises that he would never again curse the ground for man's sake. Now, the cursing of the ground at the time of the curse on Adam is still in effect. So what does God mean by saying he will no longer again curse the ground? It's not referring to the curse at the time of Adam's sin. It is apparently applied to the time of Cain's sin. So he says at the end of the flood, I'm not going to curse the ground that way again. And then he institutes capital punishment, or introduces capital punishment. So apparently, rather than cursing the murder of humans by cursing the ground, he is now going to say, okay, now from now on, after the flood, if a person kills another person, they are to be put to death. I'm no longer going to curse the ground. So this is an implication that, in fact, the ground before the flood was increasingly deteriorating, creating an economic catastrophe, a shortage of food, an increase in work as we get closer and closer to the flood. There's also it's very likely that there was an increase in earthquakes leading up to the flood. If we're right about the mechanisms of the flood that we have been able to deduce geologically, it's not likely that the flood was, in one sense, a very sudden event. It was led up to that the earth was deforming, ready to break at the time of the flood. Even if the break itself, the breakup of the fountains of the great deep, was a very sudden event, the tension in the earth that led up to that event may have been gradual and additive until the day that they finally actually broke. And this motion, this tensional motion, is likely to have been associated with earthquakes. And those earthquakes probably would have increased in frequency leading up to the flood. They wouldn't have been necessarily huge earthquakes, but it's hard to imagine that the earth wasn't being shaken by the events that are leading up to the flood. So what we have are a number of things things are getting worse and worse leading up to a significant event that we know of as the flood. And it's all preparing the earth, warning humans that there's a judgment about to come on humans, which is going to affect animals as well.